Chairman Dickey. Yeah, we'll go ahead and get started since we have several presentations, and I know we're back in before too much longer. But we're going to go ahead and call this Ways and Means Committee meeting to order. And I know other members will be filing in or may be filing in as we go along. But since we're not really taking any action today, we can go ahead and get started. Chairman Dickey's open us up in a word of prayer.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you for your many blessings. Just give us the wisdom and information we need today to citizens.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'm going to recognize our guests here to begin with their audit presentations. And this is a follow-on from last week's presentations from the folks that did the research on our 10 audits as provided for in Senate Bill 6. And so y'all please introduce yourself and to members of the committee that are here, and I'll just let y'all go with it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Rob Gordon. I serve as director of the Carl Vinson Institute of Government at the University of Georgia. It's an honor to be with you today to talk about the tax incentive studies that were conducted by the Vinson Institute. As you all know, all of us at the Vinson Institute are committed to promoting excellence in government, and our core role in all of our services is to be a trusted partner and resource that you as our government leaders can turn to for the highest quality educational programming and data-driven research and technical assistance, all of which is designed to inform your decision-making as you determine how to best serve the citizens of Georgia. We approach everything we do in an objective, nonpartisan, third-party manner with the goal of informing your decisions as policymakers. And certainly the same is true with respect to the 3 tax incentives that we studied. They were done within the framework, as you'll hear, provided by Senate Bill 6 from the last biennial, the Tax Credit Return on Investment Act of 2021. Obviously, as you will also hear, subject to data availability and the time frame in which these were required to be submitted. With that, I have a colleague here who is the principal author of the studies, Dr. Tommy Shepard, our lead researcher. I know in the interest of time, we know you've already heard from the Georgia State University about certain aspects of the methodology and the framework of Senate Bill 6. So Dr. Shepard is really going to focus his remarks specifically on the 3 studies that we did. Of course, we'll be glad to answer any questions that you may have. Dr. Shepard provides economic analysis and econometric modeling of tax policy and economic development issues. Prior to joining the Vinson Institute, he served as an agribusiness economist and a business development specialist in the University of Georgia Center for Agribusiness and Economic Development and in UGA's Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics. He's also served as an economist with USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, where he was responsible for policy analysis and price forecasting. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Shepard.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction. Also, let me just take 1 second to recognize my co-author and collaborator, Mrs. Alexandra Hill, on these studies. Mr. Chairman, committee members, thank you so much for the chance to be here and visit with you this afternoon and drill down into some of the details of the SB6 studies that we worked on last fall. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to jump right in. So I want to cover 3 studies this afternoon. One of those is the Research and Development Tax Credit, and the other 2 are sales tax exemptions, one for large-scale computer equipment purchases and the other for the construction of new data centers. So to begin with the Research and Development Tax Credit, this is a credit against taxable income for firms that engage in research and development activities. It piggybacks on the federal research and development tax credit, which is a 20% credit against taxable income. Georgia's program is a 10% credit against Georgia taxable income. When I say that it piggybacks on the federal program, taxpayers who utilize the credit meet the same guidelines and clear the same hurdles as they would for the federal program, and they have to qualify and receive credits on their federal taxes to utilize the state program. Just a little bit of economic theory behind why this exemption, why this credit exists. We think of research and development as a public good. It's one of those things that benefits all citizens. And our theory also tells us it's one of those things that is produced in insufficient quantities in the absence of some kind of a government subsidy. If I were to think of an example of that, think about the research behind sequencing the human genome. There's a tremendous amount of expense and research into that. Any one firm that could accomplish that would never recoup all of those expenses. You're looking at opening the door for things that range from medical testing to new drugs to treatments that play out over a very long period of time. That type of research likely would not happen without some kind of a subsidy like tax credits. So the Georgia tax credit is 10% of qualifying research expenditures, and since it is it's intended to encourage research and development spending. It's a credit on increases over time. So, for example, if you were a company that spent $1 million on R&D last year, you spent $2 million on R&D this year, the increase would be $1 million. 10% of that would be a credit of $100,000. Nothing is ever quite that simple. So if you really dig into the tax code, it actually looks at the ratio of qualified expenditures to gross income back over a 3-year period and takes the average of that and looks at either that or a maximum of 30%. So the devil is sort of in the details on that, but it is intended to spur increases in research and development over time. The cost in terms of foregone tax revenue to the state ranges from about $200 million to about $300 million annually. And that is looking back over data from 2015 to 2021. The credit may be used against taxable income, but frequently R&D companies do not generate taxable income immediately. It takes a long time to bring their products to fruition. So the credit may be utilized against taxable income in the period that it's earned if that taxable income exists. If it does not, it can be transferred typically to parent companies or to partners in the company who do have the taxable income to utilize that. And we learned in our discussions with the Department of Revenue that that is frequently what happens. It may also be carried forward for up to 10 years, or for startup companies with a very short history, it may be used to offset payroll tax withholding for a few years. Okay. Prior research that we've looked at in our literature review shows that the federal tax credit does a very good job of encouraging increases in research and development at a national level, but that state credits tend to be effective at shifting research activity from state to state as companies look for states where there's a more favorable business climate to operate in. So the federal credit sort of raises R&D development. The tax credits are shown to be very effective at shuffling it around between states. And this makes a lot of sense intuitively. We interviewed a number of recipients of this credit in the course of doing the research. One of those that comes to mind is a major manufacturer in the state of Georgia that owns billions of dollars of infrastructure geared towards research and development. So you can well imagine that if that research credit were not there, the infrastructure is in place that would continue to go on. I know you've already heard the explanation of but for, and that's kind of a real cornerstone to these types of studies where we ask the question, but for the presence of this incentive, how much of this activity would have taken place anyway, kind of a measure of the utilization of it. And to look at some numbers for that in our research, we looked at a decade's worth of data published by the Federal National Science Foundation that tracked R&D expenditures in states that both had a R&D credit and states that did not have an R&D credit. And we looked at the year-over-year changes in spending in those states, divided into two groups. In states that did not have a credit, we saw increases of, on an average of 5% annually. In states that did have an R&D credit, we saw increases of an average of 10% annually. So we attributed that 5% difference to the presence of the R&D credit within that state. So then our but-for percentage becomes 95%. But for the presence of that credit, 95% of that activity would have still taken place anyway. And 5% of the activity that we saw, we can attribute to the credit. Now, as part of the research, we were asked to calculate a return on investment for those credits. And let me touch on two methods that can be used to do that. One of those is what is typically referred to in the literature as a fiscal return on investment. So just to recap, ROI, return on investment, is a percentage change in the amount of money that you invest in something relative to your payoff or your return on that. So in this case, we're looking at foregone tax revenue as the investment in the something, the economic activity that we hope to see. And the payoff is that amount of activity. So when we think about two methods of calculating an ROI, one is what we refer to as a fiscal return on investment. How much tax revenue was given up by a credit and how much tax revenue was gained by whatever activity was spurred by that credit. So that kind of distills down to trading one tax revenue stream for another. And one of the things we were asked to ascertain was what was the intention of these credits or these incentives. And we felt like in our research, the intent of that was not really to trade one tax stream for another, but to incentivize economic activity within Georgia's economy. So we also looked at it as what we call an economic return on investment, or you might term that as a social return on investment. So given our 95% but-for percentage that we calculated for the R&D tax credit, we essentially distilled it down to a result that says for every $1 in tax credits, every $1 in foregone tax revenue, about 56 cents in economic activity is generated. So if you do the math on that, a negative 44% return on investment, and that is for the economic investment in that. If we were to do the same calculation for a fiscal return on investment, you would note that foregone tax revenue was in 2018, and 2018 is a year that we picked for a lot of these because it's the first, most recent year in which we don't have to deal with amended tax returns and things changing. So for 2018, $234 million in foregone tax revenue occurred because of the credit, because of the additional economic activity that was spurred by that. 3.9 million in additional tax revenues were collected. So it was nearly 100% negative loss on investment for that, negative 98% return on investment for the fiscal piece of that. Okay. But the one thing that I would be remiss if I did not bring up is there are a lot of intangibles that are not captured in input-output models and are not capable of being estimated given the data that we had available for this. So things like the fact that a research and development credit in general raises the profile of a state as being a good place to do business. And in another manufacturer that we talked to that's also a recipient of this credit, they noted that two of their upstream suppliers, who are also major manufacturers, had relocated to Georgia in recent years to be near their company, which raises that, it increases revenue, tax revenues, and it raises the state's profile as a really good place to do business. So there are these intangibles that are just simply not captured within the context of an input-output model, but are certainly worthy of consideration as we talk about these kinds of things. Okay, let me switch gears now and move on, interest of time, to two sales tax exemptions that we looked at. The first of those is for large-scale computer equipment purchases, and the second is for the construction of new data centers. Let me start with the sales tax on computer equipment exemptions. This exempts sales tax on purchases of $15 million or more by an individual taxpayer in a single tax year. And you can imagine it works a lot like the gate card for agriculture. A company applies to the Department of Revenue for an exemption letter. They verify the amount of equipment that they plan to purchase in a given year, and they're exempt from sales tax on that. This has been in place since the late 1990s in Georgia, and it's typically utilized by firms in particularly financial transactions. If you think about banking or credit card companies that process millions of transactions per day, it is used heavily by companies with online sales who manage large inventories, who handle sales online. It's used heavily by communications companies. And more recently, it is also used by data centers, which we'll touch on a bit more in a moment. But you're all familiar with the giant sort of warehouses of servers that fuel social media sites and that sort of thing. Foregone sales tax revenue on purchases of computer equipment range from $1.1 billion in 2018, according to numbers from our Department of Revenue, to our forecast of as much as $3.6 billion by 2027. Now, as far as the but-for calculation or the but-for percentage for this sales tax exemption, we looked at, since it's a sales tax exemption and it is an exemption for state and local tax, the sum of those is roughly 7%. We looked at 100% minus the 7, and we used 93% as a reasonable but-for percentage for this calculation. To put that into perspective for you just a bit, imagine for a minute, just to keep the math simple, that we had $100 to spend on computer equipment. If we were in a scenario where we had a 7% sales tax, we would spend $100, we would have $93 worth of computer equipment. If there were no sales tax, we would walk away with $100 worth of computer equipment. But if we spent $101 on computer equipment, we can't really contribute that last incremental dollar to there not being a sales tax. It had to be for some other reason. You can only plow back due to a sales tax the amount of the sales tax. So we use 93% for our but-for on this. And also let me touch on one other point that I think is really important to this exemption. When we talk about large-scale purchases of computer servers and the racks that they sit on and that sort of thing, this is something that as economists we term frequently as leakage from an economy. And that is because this is equipment that is largely produced overseas and shipped into the United States. So by virtue of that, there are not employees in Georgia who build computer servers. Actually, in our research, we did uncover one server manufacturer in Georgia. It was a small one that does very specialized equipment for the defense industry and not typically the kind of thing that goes into the server farms that we call data centers. So the majority of this equipment is produced probably somewhere overseas. There are one or two manufacturers in the U.S., but not located in Georgia. So there are not employees here who are building servers, who are servicing chips and wires and whatever goes into them locally. So all that money is something that we term typically as a leakage from the state's economy. It leaves here, it goes outside the state's economy, not to return. It doesn't spur a lot of local employment. To kind of move on to the bottom line on that one, we calculated an economic return on investment of a negative 20%. And if we look at a fiscal return on investment for 2018, we look at $44 million in foregone tax revenues. Some additional spending spurred by that amounted to about $1.6 million. So there was a little bit of clawback, I guess you could term it, in sales tax revenue, but still a negative 90% return on that exemption. Now, if we move on to data center construction, that's a little bit different example. It exempts sales tax on the purchases of building supplies used in the construction of new data centers, and it sets some thresholds. They need to be at least a $30 million construction project. In lower tiered counties, they need to be $250 million minimum projects. In tier 1 counties, and the things that are exempted from this sales tax are the building materials that are unique to making that structure a data center. So heavy duty electrical systems, raised floors, heavy duty cooling systems because of the heat that they generate, the things that transform that from being just a shell of a building into being a data center. Now, one of the issues that we ran into with this is that there have been so few taxpayers who have thus far been able to utilize this exemption. It's only been around since 2018. There were fewer than 10, we learned from the Department of Revenue. So due to data privacy rules, we were not able to have any data that we could use and publish as part of an analysis. So we took a little different approach to this in that we interviewed data center consultants, we interviewed industry groups, we interviewed some construction companies who specialize in data center construction. We combed the internet for things like press releases, announcements of when data centers were built or data centers that were announced to be built, sizes in terms of square footage, construction prices. We essentially found as much information as we could to put that together and take a little different approach. And also how the data center affects the economy is different in some fundamental ways from that computer equipment exemption, because at its core, it is largely a construction bill. It's an activity that employs construction workers within Georgia to build those, which has ripple effects through the economy. It also means that these construction projects source a lot of their materials, routers, steel, concrete, a lot of those things from within Georgia, which also means that money circulates within the state and leads to an economic impact. So there is not leakage on the scale that there is from the prior incentive that we talked about. It was really difficult to think about how to come up with a but-for percentage since it's been around for such a very short time. We did come across in our literature search a very thorough academic paper that was produced by the Virginia Center for Legislative Research, and it calculated a but-for percentage of 10%. Their market for data centers in comparison across the country looks fairly similar to Georgia's. That means that based on their research, 10% of the data centers that were built in their state were due to, 90% of the data centers that were built in Virginia were due to the presence of the exemption, and only 10% would have happened otherwise. That syncs up with some of the discussions that we had with consultants who basically told us when firms shop a site for a data center, the presence of that exemption doesn't necessarily seal the deal, but the absence of an exemption can certainly be a deal breaker for them. So we tend to think that is a pretty good take on what that looks like. A lot of other factors, though, do come into play with siting data centers. Electricity prices, water prices due to the cooling needs, the presence of fiber optic networks, and also geographic safety, I guess is a good way to put that. So they tend to not locate in places that are prone to earthquakes, tornadoes, storms, things like that. As far as an economic ROI, this is probably the only one of the exemptions that we looked at where from an economic ROI standpoint, there really was a positive effect. And we found that due to the fact that it's a fairly small exemption in terms of sales tax on a part of those construction materials, it does generate a lot of economic activity throughout the state in terms of labor and locally sourced materials. $1 in foregone tax revenue translated into about $10 in economic activity. However, when we look at the fiscal return on investment for that, we estimated that for 2018, based on our estimates, foregone tax revenue would amount to about $8.2 million, and the additional spending that it spurred in the economy would be about $2.8 million. So a negative 66% return on investment, on the fiscal return on investment, not the economic. So to sort of close that loop, I guess, because these two exemptions are very closely intertwined, as data centers are built, and we learned that they typically replace servers on about, or in their terminology, they refresh their servers about every 3 to 5 years. So you're looking at a turnover of about 20% of that server stock every year. In many cases, the cost of the servers exceeds the price of the building itself. So $1 billion data center may house another $1 billion in servers, or maybe even as much as $2 billion. As data centers are constructed and have an impact, that also will lead to sort of this cumulative effect of additional computer equipment that is refreshed and falls under the computer equipment exemption going forward over time. I think in the interest of time, that can probably conclude our summary of these three tax incentives. So the research and development incentive, and then sales tax exemptions on computer equipment and data center construction. I thank you, gentlemen, so much for your kind attention this afternoon.
Well, thank you. Would you mind taking a few questions? Looks like we have some.
I think we'd be happy to do that.
Okay.
Sure.
All right. I think 19 was first. Chairman Carpenter.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you guys for your diligent work on this material. I know it can be hard to find apples to apples conversations as you look across economies, et cetera. I had two questions. My first question is on the R&D credit. I understand it's probably going to be hard to make the math work on an R&D credit, but is it fair to say that that payout is typically in a much longer period of time? So an investment in R&D today really may not even come to fruition for the economic effects for a decade sometimes.
That would be, if I'm hearing the question as you're asking it, yes, it takes a lot of time for research and development projects to yield a marketable product, whether it's taxable income, to take advantage of that credit. Yes.
Okay. And then just one follow-up question on the other tax exemption. Did you guys take into account on the computers and the data centers, did you take into account the sales tax revenue from the energy consumption and all that type stuff?
That is built into the M-Plan input-output models. So it is very far-reaching in that it looks at an industry and then all the industries that feed into that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know who was first. 26. Chairman Parson.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for the presentation. I wanted to ask you about that large computer. That's a sales tax exemption on the purchase of that. Is that what that?
That is a sales tax exemption on the purchase of the equipment itself, the servers and racks. Yes.
Okay. I was trying to remember. I think we either extended the sunset either on that one or the other one. It was that one last year. So I was wondering, can you tell me, and I remember that, and I remember actually asking questions about that when we did it, but do you know, I mean, I don't know if you have this information or not, but do you know when we enacted that and what the current sunset is on that one?
I do believe it was enacted the mid to late 1990s. I'm sorry, I don't have that number off the top of my head. I do not know when the sunset date is.
I believe we did extend that last year.
There was a change and then it was adjusted again in the Senate. So I don't think it was quite 10 years.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chairman. 28 is, Representative Smith. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there anything that would help you, any new tools that would help you to capture a broader impact of the tax incentives? I mean, I don't, are you limited? Do you feel like you're limited in collecting that broader impact? You mentioned a term a while ago, ripple effect. You know, you look out so far, but do you need to look further? And are there any tools you need?
So when we look at the M-Plan model, which is fairly standard to the industry, and it's an input-output model, it captures the ripple effects. It captures the direct effect of the activity, whatever that may be. It captures the indirect effect, which is the upstream suppliers to that industry. So in the case, for example, of data centers, steel or concrete that go into that construction. It also looks at the upstream indirect effects of servers, which is, as we said, if they're produced overseas somewhere, it does not stimulate the economy. It also looks at the induced effects as those, let's say those construction workers spend their dollars within the economy. These studies are within the parameters of SB6. So like I mentioned, there are intangibles that input-output models simply do not capture. And we've had a lot of discussions around this as we worked through them to capture that. And in looking at some of the studies that were done in other states that have a longer history of this, their studies may tend to look more like a 2-year PhD dissertation. They are much more in depth. There may be primary data collected. And I think that depends on the committee's appetite for how deep they'd really like to drill into such things.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I gotta go.
Thank you. Good questions. Great presentation. Thank you for a very, thorough and efficient presentation of all that. Dr. Shepherd, is that correct?
Yeah.
Appreciate y'all being here. I don't see any other questions.
Thank you.
I guess we'll
Okay.
forward anything along to through Mr. Taylor if something comes up, but very much appreciate the work.
Please do. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a birthday?
It was, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was for reminding everybody that it was actually yesterday, but yeah, it was fine. Although I do think, I don't worry about the number. Plus with COVID, I feel like we lost a couple of years, so I'm going to go back a couple of numbers anyway. So yeah, but thank you for that.
Happy
Appreciate that.
birthday and go dogs.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And I believe we have one final presenter, or is there today? So once again, we'll just let you introduce yourself and you can take the floor.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of this committee for having us here today to share our research. My name is Ben McKay. I'm with the Center for Business Analytics and Economic Research at Georgia Southern University, and we are going to share our findings on these two studies that we did for this project. The first was the interactive entertainment tax credit, which focuses on the development of interactive entertainment products. It's part of the film tax credit, and it really focuses in on an easier way to put it is video games and video game development and developing those types of entertainment products in the state. And then the other one is the manufacturing sales tax exemption. This focuses on exempting from sales tax intermediate goods used in the manufacturing process. And a similar type of legislation has been on the book since 1965. So this is a longstanding exemption in some formats. So moving straight into our presentation in the instrument in the time, we'll start with the interactive entertainment tax credit, which I just zoomed right back. There we go. All right, so there are $12.5 million it's capped at 12.5 million. You can get up to 1.5 million in the credit. Typically we see about 33 companies taking advantage of this tax credit a year. And really the interesting part to me is that there was, we've limited this to being focused in on those small companies that are developing new products. So we're looking at companies that in-state payrolls of 250K or higher, and you have to have less than $100 million in sales through this. So it really allows for for the smaller companies to be able to begin developing those products that bring them into the into the marketplace and develop those in that sort of way. So we also went ahead and ran an in-plan model as everyone else did. This is an interesting tax credit because one of the ways you take advantage of it is you have to be in the process of developing a new game or product that is related to a game. So there has to be a tangible outcome at the end. It lasts about a year. The legislation calls for it to be about a year in the development process. That can be extended somewhat. You can sell the credit, but generally speaking, you have to have skin in the game before you can take advantage of the credit. That really allows us to break down the impact of this credit, because these are tangible things that are being done currently in this state. So you're looking at about $52 million a year in video game development that's taking place linked to this tax credit, and that yields a fairly strong employment figures of a direct about 197, so almost 200 direct employment, and then 387 for the totals. This using the in-plan model really allowed us to look at how those break down. We had a strong finding here, and then the other part that's the most interesting to me as a researcher is that we saw a larger percentage breakdown of the induced category, and this is the business to consumer transactions. So it really is a people-focused industry, and you're really working to develop the human capital within the software development industry as part of the tax credit and the opportunities linked to that. So you're looking at a strong at a strong gateway into a stronger software development industry through this work at some level in terms of taxes. All right. So then as we continue to break this down, we did do an alternative use as did our colleagues at Georgia State and Georgia did. We went ahead and made sure that we left the committee and the other with maximum amounts of flexibility. So we assumed that all of this would go back into the Treasury. That's not for any one particular reason on our part. We're not experts on how the committee would like to assign state resources, so we just moved it back there. So for additional development, and this really pushed the envelope forward, because when you look at over the life of the program, so we looked at a 5-year time frame, $73 million is what could have been brought back into the economy from that, and with an employment total of about 56 jobs and 110 total. So we're really looking at this and trying to move through that. So in the interest of time, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Carrie Christian.
Hi, I'm Carrie Christian. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Public and Nonprofit Studies at Georgia Southern. And we want to look at first the new tax revenue generated under current law from this provision. So we estimate the new tax revenues at about 7.4 million for the state level, and about 5.6 million of local impact, for a total of approximately 13 million in new revenue. This includes all types of state and local taxes that are modeled here. And we use this data to calculate the net cost of the credit. So the cost of the interactive entertainment credit, based on the credit utilized, was $25.9 million, almost $26 million for the years 2017 through 2021. The new tax revenue from this activity offset almost half of this cost. However, the tax revenue from that would have been generated by the alternative use is $7 million. So that gets netted against the new tax revenue to give us a net revenue loss of 19.9 million, almost $20 million. It should be noted before I leave that although there's approximately 26 million of credit utilized during those years, 2017 through 2021, there's still carry forward of the credit from those years of about $36.2 million. Of this amount, $8.2 million of that credit was set to expire if not used on 2022 income tax returns. So after the returns for 2022 are filed, we'll know what the status was of that part of the carryover. If we assume that all of these credits are utilized during the carry forward period, and we assume that utilization of future credits occurs about at the same rate of usage that the past 4 years have been, then the net cost of the credit for the years 2022 through 2026 will be approximately $56.4 million. So based on this information, the average cost per job during the years 2017 through 2021 was about $51,662. That would increase to a little over $87,000 for the years 22 through 26 if the carryovers are fully utilized. While it appears logical that all credits would be utilized since they can be sold for as little as 60 cents on the dollar, there's no guarantee that this will be the case. So as a result of that, we're recommending that the cost for the years 2017 through 2021 are the most supportable cost figures at this time. In the but-for analysis, regardless of whether we calculate the but-for based on the total credit allowed or the amount of the credit actually utilized, and there's quite a difference there, as I just pointed out, there is a link to increased economic activity as a result of the credit being provided. However, it's unclear how much of this economic activity is solely linked to the tax credit and how much would have occurred otherwise. It is viewed by industry more as a business retention tool than it is as a tool to lure larger businesses to the state, because it is limited to $12.5 million overall per year for all businesses. It does, however, it is deemed to help small businesses create new products and enhance their profitability and basically help them stay into business during the portion of their development efforts for the new video games. So a few conclusions. There were an average of 133 companies eligible for the years 2016 through 2020, and 34 video game projects were implemented during the years 2017 through 2021, which is the years that we have data for. We'd like to point out also there are 16 states that incentivize interactive entertainment. Each state has different limitations on the amount of the incentive offered, the minimum investment required, the single project caps on the incentive, and the total overall project caps. Currently, Georgia ranks 12th nationwide in employment in this industry and 13th in output of these 16. Texas, Florida, and North Carolina are notable close neighbors that are active in this industry. We also noted that new forms of entertainment are in demand and developing rapidly, and states are vying to attract those industries that supply that demand. The credit does help Georgia remain a player in this industry. It should also be noted that skills in video game development are transferable. So many employees will move on to other types of development. So this does help develop human capital to serve the wider software development industry.
Now we will go ahead and move on to our manufacturing sales tax exemption. This one was a large it's a larger exemption in general, and it is one that is definitely used regularly by industry. When we kind of break this down, we know that there are other areas included within this sales tax exemption, including mining and minerals, the electric power generation, and newspapers. However, in terms of total business establishments, manufacturing accounts for 93 or 95% of the total, where mining and quarrying is about 2.2% of business establishments covered by this tax credit or sales tax, excuse me, and like 0.04 for the electric power generation. So realistically, even though there are other industries included in this, we around the office refer to it as the manufacturing sales tax exemption. There are a number of industries included, but manufacturing dominates the overall scale of the market on this one. So really, as we looked at this one, Georgia's following the integrated plant theory, which is a way to calculate these sales tax exemption by looking at items that are necessary and essential for the production process. So if you think about what it takes to build a barn or make a cake or something like that, some states will only allow you to use a direct method. And if it has to do with the actual products going into it, the wood, the nails, those sorts of things are the only thing that are exemptable. Under an integrated plant theory, you're looking at the ability to look at other aspects of that. So it's the tools that you use to do the construction with are also included under the integrated plant theory. So as we look at the different areas listed in the sales tax exemption, I'm going to highlight two fairly quickly here in the interest of time, just to kind of give a little bit of an example here of what's included. So when we're talking about energy, we're talking about a large scale energy projects that are meant for manufacturers. It excludes gasoline taxes. So the corporations will still pay those on their fleet costs. And then the other one is material clothing for industries. Those are the stairs that allow you to access the piece of equipment purchased. So we're not putting sweatshirts on equipment here. We are allowing better access to those, and those are the two that I'm going to point out. Although logistics and packing supplies are also included in this one. We calculated out the amount of this sales tax exemption. We're looking at about $6.8 billion total across state and local governments in this state for this tax break. So it's fairly substantial, but it allows for additional development that comes out of it in a certain sense, because it's so ubiquitous across the exemptions like this are ubiquitous across the United States. So every state offers some form of exemption, with the exception of Hawaii, I believe. So as we look closer at the economic impact, this was calculated using a little bit of a different method for the input data. So we looked at the intermediate cost of goods. So it's not so when you have your output and your GDP, there's a spot that runs in between that, and those are your intermediate costs. We use those as our modeling piece for this project. And so that's how we ended up calculating this out to an $88 billion economic impact in direct terms, and then moving as it cycled through the economy, we ended up with 136 billion in million, excuse me, in 2021 and strong job numbers across the so then we also went ahead and calculated again the same alternative use following the same format that we used in the previous study. And really the big takeaway from this slide is that what we're seeing in terms of adjustments for this tax break or for this tax exemption is we move it back through the economy and give it back to the state to be able to allocate as appropriate. We're still looking at a significant impact, but not all would be recovered from the production. So I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Carrie for the next.
Okay, similar to the last analysis, we calculated the new tax revenue that would be generated from the economic activity, from the manufacturing operations, the manufacturing economic activity that Ben just talked about. So for the years 2018 through 2022, it'd be a total of about $17.8 billion. So we use this information to calculate the net cost of the exemption to the state. As we can see here, the net cost over the 5-year period of time was almost $30 billion. New tax revenue of $17.7 billion, less the foregone revenue from the alternate use of those funds of $1.4 billion, gives us a net revenue loss of almost $12.5 billion. So that's about $2.7 billion per year on average. There are a number of non-monetary benefits to this. The exemption does keep Georgia competitive with neighboring states. And perhaps more importantly, the exemptions prevent the pyramiding of tax, which occurs when manufacturing inputs are subject to sales tax and therefore result in an increase to the cost of the product to the end consumer. Sales tax are designed to be levied upon the final sale, and sales taxes levied on business inputs does result in the imposition of hidden taxes on the consumer, which violates the principle of transparency. Additionally, increased cost could make Georgia manufacturers less competitive with operations in other states that do allow the exemption, which could result in reduced investment in the state, cancellation of plans for expansion, lower wages to workers, and so forth. As far as the but-for is concerned, it's estimated based on work done by the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research that about 2% to 25%, I realize that's a pretty wide margin, of manufacturing economic activity would not have been retained or relocated to Georgia without the benefit of these exemptions. It's a wide range, but it does have a large economic impact. Output would fall by a range of a low of 2.4 billion to up to a high of 30.6 billion at the 25% range. Value added would fall from a lower range of 1 billion to a higher range of 12.7 billion. Labor, 0.5 billion to 7.3 billion. And the number of employees, 8,487 at the low end and 106,083 employees at the upper end. The ROI on this would be 54.6 cents on the dollar on an annual basis. And I think that's it.
All right, thank you. Any committee members have any questions? No. All right. Thank you all very much. And I apologize for it being kind of condensed and quick. We were trying to squeeze in. We don't always get to know what the schedule is ahead of time. So we appreciate y'all being here and bringing this information. And as Chairman Blackman said earlier, if we have any questions that come up later, we'll be sure to send those to y'all and hopefully get a response back. So thank y'all very much.
Thank you. And thank
Thank
you
you.
for the
All right,
opportunity.
meeting's adjourned.